Hi, my name's David McSween, aka 3-Point Edit, and in this tutorial from cgcookie.com we're going to be looking at some simple motion graphics backgrounds. Now, I guess like me, you'd be using Blender to communicate some sort of visual message. Usually, the message is the most important thing you want the audience to focus on. But how do you give it that focus? Well, it's really important to start off with a really sound base. And by that, I mean you need to generate some sort of background that supports your message without distracting from the overall theme or mood that you're creating. The background should have some sort of contrast but without being dominating. The background should have some sort of unique contrast to whatever the main message is, but without being too dominating. And in this tutorial, we'll be looking at a number of ways of generating this kind of background with some visual interest and finding fairly quick ways of iterating through that by using a variety of tools like the 3D view or through masks, as I have set up here, or indeed using the compositor. Here's some examples of a number of very simple backgrounds that I've set up with these ideas in mind. That is, simple contrast and keying in on a theme and trying to play off of the intent of your main theme or what you're trying to communicate. Now, with all of these different scenes that I've created, the main features are that it should be quick to render and easy to change or manipulate. We don't want to spend a lot of time reconstructing things in 3D and adding drivers and constraints just to get a unique change of effect. So I've been concentrating on animating masks and using those in the VSE and using the VSE to create all sorts of unique shapes and variation. Now, before we start, let's get rid of some useless stuff. As I said, we don't really want to spend too much time worried about the animation of meshes, right? So we can throw all that in the bin, get rid of these unsightly meshes and extra vertices. Oh, we don't need that. And the other thing we can get rid of, I guess, is cycles, because cycles just takes up a lot of system overhead. When you want to be iterating through very clean motion graphics, cycles, whilst it's a very fast renderer, tends to be somewhat noisy unless you've got a very expensive video card or quite a lot of time. But when we're prototyping these sorts of things, I'll just stick with Blender's internal render engine for now. In part 2 of this tutorial series, I'll be looking at the basics of color and design theory so that we can construct a more cohesive background environment that we can display our message on. Oh, I hope my daughters don't realize I pinched their bicycles for this tutorial. Hi, and welcome to part 2 of this tutorial on simple motion backgrounds in Blender. Now, you remember that in part 1 we discussed what was important about trying to create a solid background for your design. I like to think of backgrounds a bit like a comic duo that you might find performing in the real world, like Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. One's a straight man and the other one's the funny guy. Now, the straight man's the foil, or the serious person who sets up all the jokes, but he never gets the laughs. However, his role is the most important part of the act. It serves as a contrast for all that hilarity that comes later on. They really are very important for setting up the message, or in their case, the laughs. Now, creating backgrounds is a little like being your straight man for the design. It sets up the communication so the message gets knocked out of the park, but he doesn't fight for the attention. That's the crucial part. Now, some people know the basics of design. The ones like they suggest highlighting a main element or a focal part of your image. You can do this with colors that stand out or use elements that are large on screen and give a sense of advancing forward. Now, neither of these ideas work without contrast in the background. So in this instance, I've got a fairly neutral sort of background with a subtle texture that reinforces the traditional style of the main font that I've used here in the main part of the title. And the title itself is a black font, so it's standing out against a light, fairly muted background. So you can have all sorts of different contrasts. You can have contrasts in value, that is the brightness of the image, but you can also have contrast in colors. Contrast could even indicate things as simple as the difference between sharpness and blur. As you can see in this image, I've got the same photo in the background, but then where I would like the text to be placed or the animation to occur has got a nice blur across it, as well of course having a different value in the monochrome nature of the image in the background. Now you want to consider things like your message, and depending on what your message is, you might want a very simple background, which is very much like the cyclorama, which really just consists of a smooth surface that has been bent up at 90 degrees with this gentle curve in the middle, and that indicates a very clean and refined look, on top of which you could put very modern fonts or geometric forms. Now, something to try and remember about our design is that we want to try and strive for a harmonious design that doesn't distract the viewer from the main message. Did you know that colors also come in harmonious sets? There is a range of different types of color contrasts that are pleasing to the human eye. In this case, we're looking at a monochromatic display. As I change the color wheel, you'll notice that the range of values or brightnesses of each color as I swing around the wheel changes. So these are nice luma offsets from your standard hue. So these work quite well together as just different saturations of the same thing. Then there is a complement of that color. So if I swap that around to red, you can see the complement of red is down here at green. So that's a nice complementary color to use in our color schemes. There are other ones like adjacent colors, where the color hues immediately adjacent to the main one also produce pleasing color combinations. There's triads with complements. This just happens to be the Qatine online color tool. It's a completely free web-based color tool, and you can sample the colors over here by hovering and getting their hex code, which is great for entering into Blender directly into its color windows. Back in Blender, I've applied some of these design techniques. First of all, I've taken my fairly neutral background with a slight texture projected onto the cyclorama, and then I've added a foreground of black font in a couple of different contrasting font styles. Now I've added two masks, in fact. Let's have a look at the first one. It's this one. It's a square mask on layer 1, which is a merge add. So if I turn that off and I turn on the overlay display, whoops, like that, you can see the square mask with a feathered edge. And then I've added this secondary layer on top, which is a circle with a feathered edge, but it's in as a subtract. So I'm doing a cutout shape here. I'll turn that on so you can see what it looks like. Now I'm applying this mask to my VSE layer down here as a strip modifier. I've already applied these modifiers. This one, the first one, is a color balance. And you'll remember our color change. I've decided to lift the gain, which is the bottom one, of the white values, and I've produced an offset. The offset value here is a hex value, EAD0C3. EAD003C. Not as much saturation. And the complement down here, 675A88. A88. We scroll up, turn on our mask. It's rather strong. Back that off a bit. It's that purple color we're looking for. Now this is very saturated, so let's pull that out. So if I go back to my mask, and because it's an additive mask, we'll go back to the first layer and pull out some of the value there, so we're not getting as much mask. Come down and refresh on the refresh sequencer and pull some of that out. So there we go, we now have a complementary tone between our main primary background color and a secondary background color to emphasize. And I've built in a curve, so there's a contrasting form, a design form here that leads the eye back around, so we get a circular motion going with our reading lines. So there's a simple example of using Blender's tools to create some interesting contrast in color and form, so that you can create an effective background for your titles or motion graphics. In part 3, we'll be looking into creating a bunch of different background types with a range of different tools in Blender. Thanks very much for watching. Oh, now before I go, looking back at the color wheel, you may have realized that this is where a strangely familiar color combination comes from. Yes, it's the Hollywood orange and teal. So, sunburnt faces and blue shadows originate from this simple color combination, where it's the complement of orange, which is teal, or blue shadows, if you like. Thanks, Hollywood! Welcome to part 3 of this tutorial series, Creating Simple Backgrounds for Motion Graphics. This time I thought I'd take a somewhat unusual approach for a Blender tutorial. I'm going to start with not deleting the default cube. I know it's a pretty radical approach. Let's turn on the ghost transparency so we can see to the other sides. I'm going to select face mode, delete some faces here. Delete these faces, X to delete, so that we're just left with this right angle profile of the cube. I'm going to add a modifier to that, subsurface, increase the subsurf on this. I'm going to smooth the cube, and it's a bit rounded, so let's go back into edit mode. I'm going to select all of the cube. Let's go back to edge select and deselect this edge that's hidden. I want to make all of the edges fill out here, so we can go to mesh, go up to edge menu, we want edge crease, or you can go shift E and pull it out like that. Now I have a rather large curve there. I would like a nice gentle cyc screen but with a tighter curve, so I'm going to select this hidden edge and I'm going to tighten that up with a edge seam. So move that out and you can see the curve tightens up quite a bit there for our little cyclorama screen. I'm going to tab out of edit mode, select the camera. I'm going to clear its rotation and position, so that will be Alt G to clear and Alt R to clear the rotation, or Option R on Mac like I have. I'm going to rotate an X-axis through 90 degrees to point it back at the screen. This is fairly arbitrary where I'm leaving it at the moment. I might move the cyc screen up. Let's press 0 to look through the camera lens. And let's scale the size of the cyclorama here. So scale, constrain to X, and scale it out like that. If I press Shift Z, and you can now see that we have this smooth edge around the cyclorama screen. Now I'm going to change its material to fairly neutral material and get rid of the speck. That's this highlight here. We remove that. So we have a very diffuse sort of background that doesn't intrude too much on whatever our foreground might be. Now the other thing, I'll tab back to Z so we can see wireframe mode. The other thing we want is to move the lamp. I'm actually going to use the default lamp. Oh, goodness me, this is a pretty radical approach for a Blender tutorial, I know. So keep it as simple as possible. Now what I like to do, once I get all of this set up, is I like to keep this all as my default, so that when I need to generate a very quick background, I have all of this set up already. So let's hit the render mode. We could go down here and click render. And you can see that with my light selected that we can determine where to place the lamp. I like to have it hovering up here in the middle. Not refreshing too well just at the moment. What we might do is split the screen. Let's do this. So we'll come up here and turn that on rendered so we can see what's going on. We might also select the camera and increase the pass per 2 so we're not rendering all that extraneous material around the side. and we'll leave this one in edit wireframe mode so I can move it more interactively. So what I like to do is tailor the lighting of the background so that using a simple lamp we can decide whether we want a high contrast or a high key image like this, or a low key image. Move it down a little bit more like this, depending on how much we want to play the background back or bring it forward, depending on whether, I guess, we're using a white lettering or a black lettering or a coloured lettering on the foreground. Now the other thing you can do with the lamp very easily is we can duplicate the lamp and we can give it a colour, of course. We can reduce the distance that the lamp is covering, say down to 3 units, so that you can see here that it's only colouring a portion of the screen. And we can reduce the energy as well. Now we're getting a nice tonal hue variation. If I duplicate that lamp, perhaps to the other side here, we might like to get some compositional change with the hue. So if we go and remember our complementary colours, we might like to pick some alternate or complementary hue across the other side, so we get a nice gradient across there. So there we go, we have a very simple background set up very quickly with the 3D view. Now something else that we might like to approach is to give this background some variation, and a simple way of doing that would be to add a texture. But as we have a very straightforward geometry here, I don't want to go adding more geometry except for perhaps altering the normal characteristic of the faces. So let's add a texture, and I'll put in a Voronoi texture so you can see the Voronoi affecting the background, the actual surface of the material. But instead of changing the color, I'd like to try something different. First of all, let's change the way that we are mapping onto the surface here. So I'm going to turn off mapping in the Z direction, so we're no longer mapping vertically, and I'll tighten up the scale here as well. So what I'm looking for here is kind of an icicle effect. Now that we've determined the shape and size of the effect of the texture, I'm going to turn off the color effect and change the geometry of the cyclorama by modifying the normal value. We get more or less of this effect. And then we can animate this value over time. So if we change the offset value, create a keyframe there, and we move up the timeline, we can change where the offset occurs in time. Let's keyframe that. So now it looks like a strange ice settling effect over time. So there's one simple way of modifying a surface texture to give some variation to our background image. So if you need some simple movement, you can always animate a texture to modify the normals. In this example, what I've done is actually eliminate the cube altogether, and I simply have a straightforward plane with a very simple material which has very low specularity, or zero specularity again. So no more shiny hotspots for this plane. And what we've done here is created this sort of pseudo cyclorama with even fewer vertices, or much less memory required, and that's because I'm getting variation in the background by simply using lights. In this case, the textured surface that you can see here is being projected from this spot lamp. So here you can see the spot, and it has a texture applied to it, which is marble, as you can see here. And the texture is being projected from the spot lamp, although you can't see an example of it here at the moment. So if I increase the energy of the spot lamp, you can see that texture is quite apparent. But I have it down quite low so that it's a very muted textured surface. You could use a photo, concrete, or other sort of natural environment there would be quite useful. Anyway, that's a simple projection. Then I have the coloured lamps that we saw before, this one being a blue up in the corner, and its complement, sort of orangey colour, down in the bottom corner. Then I've also got another interesting lighting effect happening, And that's what we can see here. It's two simple lamps that are made from area lights. So here is an area lamp, and here is its partner area lamp above it. What I've done is simply parent these two together, and now wherever I want to put them on screen will be the point of variation. So if I want to have mostly floor sort of effect, I would put the delineation of the two surfaces here. If I want it right down the bottom, so it's a very high negative space above, then we can have it there. I can rotate the horizon so that we can have an apparent tilted surface if we want to. So that's what we can do with a simple background with simply adding some lights. Of course, you can animate those if you want. This time I'm using the video sequence editor, and I've added a scene, the simple scene that we had earlier with the textured lighting, and I've added that as a scene strip in the VSE. You'll see that there's nothing in the 3D view, but what I'd like to do is animate or add interest to this image by animating a mask. So let's create the mask first of all. Create a new mask. I'm going to call this bar, mask bar, and I'm going to add a square mask, scale that up somewhat, scale with the Y constraint, G to move that. Now I'm going to park back at the beginning of the scene. I'm going to G drag this with the Y constraint, G and Y, and move it up so it's off of the screen. Now I'm going to make a keyframe, so press I for keyframe. You'll notice this little yellow line appear here, and in the dope sheet editor you can now see a little keyframe appear. Then if we drag along a little bit further, G and Y to constrain, we'll drag it back down, and we'll create another keyframe with the I key, and you can see another little orange line indicating a new keyframe, and here is the keyframe. Now we could drag that if we want to speed it up or slow it down. Now we can't see the effects of this mask anywhere yet, so let's add a color strip as an effect to our timeline. G to drag that up, and let's right mouse click on the end and G to drag that along. Now we've activated that strip. I'm going to scroll up and give it a color. So here we go, it's a color strip. So let's pick a color here, maybe a nice strong bold blue. And then we scroll down to our modifiers, strip modifiers, and this is the properties panel of the VSE. You can press the N key like this, N, to get the properties. Scroll down here to add strip modifier. We're going to select the mask, and we're going to turn on a mask property for the modifier. We're going to select bar with capital B, and you can see here our animated mask appear. Now it's showing us an alpha overlay or an transparent overlay, but of course it's not transparent. So let's change the properties of our strip so that it's an overdrop or an alpha over. Let's try alpha over, and there we go. So now we have an animated bar appearing without any 3D geometry required. I can press animate to play that back, nice and quick. Now the other things I could do, of course, is I could change the opacity here, or play that, or what I could do is leave the opacity up there, and I could change the opacity over here for the mask. If I go to the N key and scroll down to its opacity, we can change the value of the opacity in the mask itself. So we go back here, you can see that's updated in the VSE now. Sometimes if you get a glitch like this seems to be doing, or you get a full frame, if you press refresh sequencer, it should update that frame and work correctly for you. I'll add another color strip, G, and drag that up, drag that out. Let's see, what kind of color will we make this one? Maybe an adjacent color, like this purple. And we'll add another modifier, another mask. There we go. And likewise, we'll scroll back up to the top, change this to an alpha over. So we have multiple masks running at the same time. This one's not animated, however. Now, of course, this mask could also, instead of acting on a color, if I delete this, X to delete, what I could do is actually change the value of the strip. We can do that with a curve. We can pull the curve down and it acts across the entire image. And then we can add a mask. We'll add a spot mask back on again. So you can see that it's having effect based on the nature of the mask, and the mask in this case looks like this, which is a bunch of concentric circles that all add up to different opacity values, like we saw with that bar mask. So you can see there I've added them with merge add, but I've added different values so that they accumulate over the course of their layers to become more like this target effect. So that's a simple way of adding additional interest to your background simply by editing some masks and perhaps even animating them as you go. So there's lots of different features that you can animate even with simple masks, and you can add value to these masks by changing the nature of their adds or subtracts as well. So if we want to move to a different position, we can add another layer like this. We can turn off the editing of the background layer, and we could perhaps perform a subtraction. Make it a feathered edge, drag it off a little bit, add a keyframe, and we can move a little bit further on. G, drag it down, maybe scale that up, add another keyframe, and this time we'll make it a subtract. Refresh sequencer. Oh, we have to turn back on the render. Refresh sequencer again. Play to animate that. Here we can see the feathered edge of the first element completing, and then we should be approaching the animation for the circle mask. And you can see it appearing around the edges here of the circle. Now you can see that subtraction mask animating quite nicely. Hi, my name's David McSween, also known as 3-Point Edit. Now we're going to be tying all of what we've learned so far up into a straightforward little piece. Lots of graphic design in there and quite a bit of audio too. I whipped out GarageBand on my Mac. I'm sure you can grab some terrific music resources like some open music online with copyright free if you need it, or you can pay for wonderful artists to produce music for your piece. I was able to throw a couple of loops together. Now I've got my setup scene, my basics like my curtain or cyclorama scene, and I've lit it quite simply with a spot lamp. As you can see here, it's got a very wide angle of value however, and let's just pop into quad view so you can see what the lamp's illuminating. So it's pointing up, and I've also applied a texture to that simple surface, again varying the normals. Quick tip, I can look at the rendered view through the quad view as well as have access to my regular material view just by changing the rendered region with Control B. That's that little box in the top corner of each of those quad view windows. So I get to have my camera view as a full render, but the quad views, the side, top and front, stay in the material view, which makes things easier to edit. Now popping back into another scene and another editor, and that's some scene masks, and in this case I wanted to animate the mask, but I wanted to use the scene as a strip, so I'm having to generate the mask as a bit of black and white artwork, and I do that by making its own scene, animating the mask, and you can see that it's called the mask box wipe, and there's two of them here, and they animate by sliding across the field of view, like one and then the other. And we covered this in an earlier tutorial segment, and that's quite straightforward. Just generating keyframes as you change the places of the mask over time. Now I want to generate these masks as black and white artwork because they exist in their own scene. You can see that it's called Scene Mask Wipe, but the mask information won't translate out of that scene. I have to generate the mask as a black and white media so that the scene output from the compositor is available in my VSE editing scene. And in that scene, I need it to be just black and white. There's no alpha information directly from the masks themselves. So that's what I've got up here. I'm feeding a mask straight out into the compositor output, and that will be available in my VSE scene. Now if we pop back into the master scene, you can see that I've also generated our very simple psych backgrounds, just a plane that we project some light onto. Here's my projected texture, which is a spot lamp again with a texture element mapped into it, and that's throwing that interesting looking sort of wibbly wobbly lines on the background. Most of that is quite overwhelmed in the original art, but it's just there to add a bit of hint of interest. You can see when I turn it off, it goes away. I've got a subtle blue lamp up in the top corner. That's just a point lamp, and then a yellow hue down the bottom. And in addition, I have these other lamps, which are a couple of area lamps, which are directional lamps, and they're pointing opposite to each other. But they're also parented, well, not parented to one another. They are actually, one is using the constraint of the other. So the bottom one tracks to the top one. And the reason I do that is I wanted to create a group of these lights to be able to animate them independently afterwards. So what I've done is I've selected one of the items, one of these lights, and I've lined it up so that it gives you a horizontal, remember that fake cyclorama effect. So the two of them at opposing angles gives me a small black line. I've also added these constraints. So you can see the top one is unaffected, but the bottom light inherits the position information and the rotation information from the original source, the original light. It also has a bit of offset so that I can place it anywhere I want, and also has to operate in world space. Otherwise, if I change it over to local space, it relocates back to its original position, which I don't want. Now I've added both of these area lights to a group, uncreatively named group, and I'm going to instance this group a couple more times so that I can animate them. And when you instance a group, you get a parent object, an empty, that allows you to animate their origin point. So you can see that if I place the empty in the center of screen, that was the world origination, and it lines up with the original of the duplicate. Now if I animate these, you'll notice that the constraint is still working. So I'm rotating the first duplicate. The second duplicate is pointing at the first duplicate, so it's inheriting its new rotation, and it's rotating around its new origin point, which is that empty. So I can animate that, and I'll show you how I've done that on another layer. I've already animated a couple of these. And you can see here that I have one additional lamp at the moment, one additional group lamp. And what I've done is actually start in its final position. So in a moment I'll show you where its final position is. There's the other group. Turn that on. You can see that there's quite a bit of rotation going on there. I just wanted a bit of variety with their rotation. I guess I could just stick with the Z-axis rotation through the middle of the lens, but anyway, this makes a bit more variety with the fall off. So I started looking at what I would like to finish at, and that I wanted this unique parallel but offset angle so that I get this sort of 30-degree slope down to my horizon line. From there I reversed back to the first frame and started my animation with quite a bit of rotation offset. And I placed them on different layers so I could switch them in and out without having to fiddle around with their value controls for illumination. Right, so that's it for part 1. In part 2, we'll look at animating the text and then compositing it all in the timeline of the VSE. Okay, in this section we'll be looking at animating some text and then compositing the results over the VSE. I've started out with 3 simple text objects and they all have material colours that are just simply black. I'm not illuminating them anyway because I want a high contrast background. The first one is the word Blender, and I've started with them all rotated at a 45-degree angle. You can see that here. They're all pretty much the same and they're going to slide into their final position. What I've done is animate them with slightly different effects, and they're all going to slide into their final positions via the text attributes. So instead of animating the position of the text, which could, when it's running diagonally, suffer from an incorrect value change from its XY position. So I wanted them all to slide in. I've also added a wave just to give some added interest to the word Blender, the first unit that comes in. It's working on a music beat, I believe. So that's just a modifier on the text that I've animated with some simple beginning and ending positions. Right, so if I look at the animation for this text, you'll notice that I'm actually animating the offset. So it begins up to the right and then it slides down. You can see the X offset is changing. So because I've rotated the object, I'm only animating one value. The rotation is already built in. So it's going to slide down from the offset value here. You can see in the F-curve editor that I'm looking at the X offset. I've only highlighted that in the F-curve editor, and you can see that it will slide straight down. Oh yes, in addition to the slide, I've also changed the kerning. That is the spacing between the letters. It's probably not really kerning because you don't get to do it on an individual character basis, but certainly you can spread the letters far apart and they all bunch up closer together as it slides into frame. Now I've repeated this process for the other text objects. They also slide into frame, but I didn't apply a modifier to them, nor did I change their letter spacing. So it's a simple animation of the offset value. Now you can see the modifier that I've applied to the main word text, and it's simply applying to the X value so that it comes up towards the camera. And you can see that I haven't had to animate anything. I've set the values to give me a nice bulge, but what we've changed or preset is the offset, that is the frame offset where the animation begins, and the life of the animation. So none of these are editable values, but they're preset values that you can place in there. So I'm effectively getting one wave from the wave modifier. If I had a longer life value, then the wave would continue throughout the animation. Of course, if you leave the life value to 0, it will just continue waving indefinitely. Of course, if I don't want a very large bulge effect, you can modify the values or the shape of the wave with its width, height and narrowness. Alright, let's head back to the VSE now, where we can composite all of these elements together. Now, of course, we've got our initial background scene ready and some audio to cue against. Now, I'd like to put those little blue strips in. So the first thing I'm going to do is add the scene for the mask boxes. That's right, I'm using the scene strip. Remember, I want to be able to slide where this mask effect occurs on the timeline if required later on. So there we have the black and white rendered mask or holdout shape. Now I'm going to split that. I don't need the entire duration of the scene strip, so I'll cut that there. Discard the tail of the scene strip, X to delete, and I don't actually need to leave this strip here. It could slide anywhere along, and you can see that I can actually manipulate when it occurs without touching any of those pesky keyframes on the dope sheet editor, but it doesn't have to be visible, so I can pop it down underneath my background art, as long as it's available relative in time to my other scene. Now I'm adding the scene strip here with the blue curtain effect. There it is, and that's static. I guess it could be a freeze, just a rendered image, a JPEG or something like that, but in this case I'm taking the rendered scene. Now I'm going to add a modifier here, a mask modifier, and it's going to, instead of being the mask, which I couldn't move, slide easily left and right, and I could not reuse, I'm going to use the strip as a source for the mask instead. So here we are, I find the scene for the mask, and you'll notice that the background is now keying all the way through. But unfortunately it's not showing my background, and that's because the strip's blend type is set incorrectly. Currently it's across, it should be alpha over. So here we go with alpha over. Now it's wherever there is alpha showing as transparent, it shows the background instead of the alpha channel itself. Now I'm going to make a duplicate of this blue curtain scene strip because I'd like to add a bit more variety to the shot. Now I'm going to set an effect strip on top of this. So let's go Shift A to add effect, down to effect strip, and then up to, let me see, transform effect. Now the transform effect of course starts with its blend type is replaced. We don't have a source available at the moment, so it's showing us the current alpha transform. So let's just change the rotation first. I wanted to have an up and down movement instead of a left and right movement, but unfortunately it's cropping out the sides of the frame. Now obviously it's not as high as it is wide, so let's just change its scale. Of course I'm changing its height, but because it's been rotated it looks like I'm changing its width. And that looks pretty nice, but let's try changing the blend type to say add or alpha over. Oh, alpha over. Let's try add. Add looks nice. Very contemporary. Oh no, it seems to be going the wrong way. Of course I didn't want it to go that way, I want it to go up and down. So let's change that rotation back to 90 degrees instead of minus 90. And now it's transiting from top to bottom. So let's have a look at what else is in the VSE timeline. I have an adjustment layer effect that just changes whatever is underneath. And in this case I've added a strip modifier of the mask band effect. So let's pop over to the UV image editor and dial up the mask band effect. You can see that there are two mask layers appearing in this mask, and they are both set up differently. Let's just turn off the second one and have a look at the first one. It slides in at this time, and you can see over on my adjustment layer that the effect it's giving is a cutout of this orange effect. Now you can see I've applied a modifier here, a color balance modifier, so making the midtones and the whites orange, and it's affecting this background strip. So wherever the mask allows through the adjustment is where we're getting this orange. So it's the mask band mask. You turn it on and off, you can see its effect there. Now, as that has not been rendered to its own scene, it's pretty much fixed at this point in time unless I move its keyframes. And then I have a second mask layer, and this one animates in to allow the words to appear in their own strip. So if I just turn those back on with their visibility, you also notice that it's set for a merge subtract, whereas the other one was a merge add. What does this mean? Well, the first one adds white, the second one is a merge subtract, takes white away. And if I turn on the overlay, you can see the effect of these masks as they interact mathematically, as an add and then as a subtract. And you can see it removing the first mask layer. And over in the VSE window, you can see the effect it's having on the adjustment layer. It's cutting a hole in the orange. And just flip that around and get a quick idea of what a double add would do. You can get multiply shapes on top of each other, it's quite handy. And you may remember from an earlier part of the tutorial, we looked at putting a circle cutout on one of our other wipe effects. So anyway, those two elements are now sliding into frame, and they're affecting our adjustment layer on the timeline. And here they are up in the dope sheet editor. You can see their keyframes. Now, in order to change when these slide effects are happening, I would have to grab and drag them around. Of course, it makes it a little bit more interactive for the music because you can set the keyframes to the music. But it is a bit annoying otherwise. Then there's one other effect that we've created with a mask, and that's this spot effect. Now what I've done is added another adjustment layer on top, and in this case I've chosen to keep it as just a replace blend type. So where does this color effect come from, the little slight blue tinge? Well, down here there's another strip modifier, and in this case it's acting upon the curve. So for the blue tinge, I'm actually taking out some red. You can see that the white value turns a bit blue, and then for the brightness I'm just pumping up the mid-range, so it's a bit of a gamma correction. It gives me a nice hot spot without burning out the whites. And that happens over the course of the effect. Now the effect is coming from a circle mask that's expanding in size. And where's this happening? Well, if we go back to the UV image editor, we can see another mask called mask circles. And if I slide the play indicator backwards and forwards, you can see that I've keyframed this mask to change size over time. Here it is in the dope sheet editor. There's the keyframes. You can see them changing size. Now what I wanted to do on top of that is have it fade out. As you can see, it's completely opaque white at one point. There's the keyframe at value 1. If we go to the F-curve editor and have a look there, you won't be able to find the mask. It only appears in the dope sheet. But unfortunately, not all the values have keyframes, and in this case, there is no keyframes available in the dope sheet editor for opacity. So if you set a keyframe for opacity and you're not happy with it in your mask tool, then you'll just have to delete it and try again. Otherwise, you could always keyframe the adjustment layer instead. Of course, the problem with that is that you're not animating the opacity of one element or one layer of your mask. Rather, you're stuck having to adjust the mask in its entirety. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this series, quite a long series, all about building backgrounds in Blender. Let's have a look at the fruits of our labours, and I'll try and be more concise next time. Thanks very much for watching.